Today we're exploring Cornel West's Race Matters because race still matters obviously today in the US. And so we have been talking about identity and various aspects of identity. So last week we talked about gender and sexuality a little bit, and now this week we're thinking about race and what it means to be racialized in the US and what it means to be a person of color. And specifically, Cornel West is addressing issues within the African American community. He himself is African American, and so a lot of these issues, though, can apply to other communities of color. So Race Matters is basically Cornel West's discussion of how there's still a lot of inequality in the US between African Americans and white individuals, and also amongst other people of color. And so he's a political philosopher, and so he's thinking about how democracy is failing people of color. And so he says that in the preface, the purpose of a democracy is to curb the arbitrary use of power against its citizens or against its people. And so we don't see that happening in the US for West. He's basically saying that America is failing people of color and democracy is not really working for everyone. It ends up being a tyranny of the individuals who have power over the individuals who don't have power, and it just kind of manifests, and it's a way of perpetuating white supremacy. When we use the term white supremacy, we're not just talking about extreme like Nazis and individuals who are part of the KKK. We're talking about aspects of white supremacy that are manifested into our everyday life. So the language that we use, the lack of media representation, dynamic media representation of people of color, or racist beauty standards, Eurocentric norms for beauty, the widening wealth inequality. And that's why we do have to talk about class and race as intersecting together, because that's how real life is. So for all of these reasons, Cornel West is saying that American democracy is failing people of color, and we really have to address it. We really have to talk about it in order to make things better. We can't just keep brushing it under the rug. We actually have to have an important conversation about this and an open conversation about this. And so while this was published in the late 90s, I think you'll see that a lot of these issues that he's talking about are still problems today. So he is also critiquing capitalism. So think back to Marxism and all the things we talked about with alienated labor and how the worker doesn't really feel respected, the worker doesn't really feel like their humanity is maintained. And so Cornel West is making a very similar critique of capitalism and market culture, and basically saying that with market culture, everyone and everything is up for sale. We commodify ourselves, and we are constantly commodifying other people instead of respecting their humanity. So we're really focused on private success, meaning financial success, over public consideration and the growth of a democracy and the growth of human values. And so this market culture is having a devastating impact upon everyone, but especially upon people of color, and specifically upon African Americans in this country, because we see how they're dealing not only with racism, but also with classism and poverty, and how you have this deprivation of jobs that people used to have in urban environments like Detroit, for example, and that leaves people unemployed and homeless, and we see a lack of consideration for people who are experiencing these forms of oppression. And he also talks about how, personally, amongst the African American community, this leads to a type of nihilism where people become apathetic, or a clinical collective depression where people just don't care anymore. And he's not saying that everyone who's African American is experiencing this, but he's saying especially low-income African American individuals are experiencing this apathy where they feel like, well, whatever I do isn't going to matter because the society I live in doesn't respect me, the political leaders don't respect me, so how can I respect myself, or how can I get myself out of the situation when there aren't any structural kind of institutions that can help me get out of it, and then no one believes in me, so how can I really believe in myself? And so he says that there is a lack of positive leadership within the African American community. He says this leads to a crisis amongst Black youth, and he talks about the intersections of market forces and white supremacy kind of nefariously working together that results in further oppression against the African American community. So in the introduction, he kind of poses what he focuses on chapter 1, so I'm not going to talk about it too much, but he says that there are inadequacies in both the liberal structuralist perspective and their idea of social change versus the conservative behavioralist perspective and their idea of social change. And so both of them kind of clash. And he's saying that neither of them are perfect together. And we'll talk more about this in the next video. But we have to really think about not just how to fix things, but what are the deeply ingrained flaws of American society? What was this country founded on, for example? So we have to think about Native American genocide. We have to think about slavery and the profits that came from slavery. We have to talk about segregation and the civil rights movement and all of this really, really terrible history that we have that we still see manifested in some present day traditions and customs and ways of thinking that people have and policies. And so he says that if we're talking about these deeply ingrained flaws, we have to think about the intersectionality of class and race and how we see poverty coalescing with racism, and specifically poverty when it comes to people of color, because they are dealing with racial discrimination, but also a lack of opportunities to economically move up. So how do we address these issues? How can we overcome these issues? Well, he says that we really have to think about the common good. We can't just let this market force culture completely take over. We can't completely internalize it. We really have to think about the fact that we exist and we are intersubjective, thinking back to existentialism. So we have to really think about the common good and how we impact other people and how we can be unified and come together in solidarity. And so that's how he concludes the introduction of Race Matters.